Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to the MindTrace Podcast episode number 6. I'm your host, Ajmal Savari, and today we'll look into the science of sensory integration and transformation with our guest, Pieter. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MindTrace Podcast. In this podcast, we're bridging the gap between science and its application in UX. We're having conversations with guests from these two worlds, all with the aim of figuring out the UX of certain industries, how UX can use scientific discoveries, what UX industries can learn from each other, and what questions UX has for science. Our guest today is Professor Pieter Medendorp. Pieter is the head of the Sensorimotor lab at the Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition and Behaviour, where he's also the chair of Sensorimotor Neuroscience and the director of the Donders Center for Cognition. Pieter's research interests focus on the relationship between brain and behavior, and in particular, the neuro-computational coupling between perception and action. For his work, he has received the Career Development Award from the Human Frontier Science Program and the Radboud Science Award. He was also awarded the Dutch Vidi and Vici grants, as well as the European ERC Consolidator grant. He is currently a board member of the Neurocontrol of Movement Society, member of the Dana Alliance for Brain Initiatives, and member of the editorial board of the Journal of Neurophysiology, and serves as a review editor of the Journal of Neuroscience. In this conversation, we talk about the science of sensory integration and transformation, specifically how these very fundamental processes impact us on a daily basis without us even realizing it. We discuss how our senses can fool us and how that experience can be fun. We make links to industry and how forms of therapy and diagnosis can improve using these principles. Enough background. Let's get into it, shall we? Hi, Pieter. It's good to see you again.
Yes.
It's been some time. It's 5 months since we last saw each other.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And even back then, I told you for quite some time that I wanted to ask you if you wanted to do a podcast session with me.
Yeah, I think you asked me already last summer.
Yeah.
So it's almost
But you're a busy man.
Now. So are you, aren't you?
No. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good to be busy. Yeah. I mean, in a good way.
Of course.
Busy, productive, not just busy for the sake of being busy.
That's not good, huh?
No. So the podcast today is supposed to be about the science of sensory integration and transformation. To whoever I talked to before, most people don't even know what sensory integration is supposed to be. Could you explain that for us a little bit?
Well, do you ask me to talk about sensory integration or sensorimotor integration, or how specific do you want me to be? You want to give me a broad scope?
Yeah, let's start with sensory integration.
Sensory
first.
Integration. Well, what is sensory integration? Well, everyone knows, I think, that the human body, let's talk humans here, has multiple sensors, sensory systems. We have our vision, our eyes, that detect light from the environment. There is, of course, our ears, our audition. There is a sense of body. How is your body oriented? Where are your hands? Where are your fingers? That's proprioception or somatosensations. You feel touch on the body. And the brain uses all these different sensory signals in order to infer the state of the body. So how is your body? What about your body? How do I perceive my body? And how is this body organized within the world? And so the brain builds up a percept based on all that sensory information. And that process is called sensory integration. So different sensory modalities need to be combined. Integration is a kind of combination. And one of the questions then is, how is this combination, this integration of sensory systems, information from different sensory systems, being done? Because let me give you an example. I can see a bird in a tree, but I can also hear it. So how do I build up that percept of that bird there in the tree? Is that because I see it, or because I hear it, or do I combine different sensory inflows? And apparently, if you think about the human body, the human brain, the brain picks up multiple sensory cues in order to come up to a percept of that little bird there. And it not only uses the visual system, but it also uses the auditory system, and it uses all kinds of systems, sensory inputs that it can use in order to achieve such a percept. And I would say that is sensory integration.
Because we do only have one percept. That's how it feels to us. It's
in
just
the end,
one
percept. It feels like the brain builds up one percept.
Yeah. Even though it's different sources coming in.
Different sources. Percepts can also be illusory, of course.
Yeah.
But apparently it seems that we have some integrated percept that is seamless, is not interrupted. If there's an interruption in our sensory inflows, so now and then you feel that. But that process is sensory integration. And another complexity to that process is, of course, that the brain needs to take into account that the information that it achieves through the sensory system is not all equally reliable. Mm-hmm. Some information might be a bit more reliable than other information. And so then the question is, does the brain take that difference into account? And some people think, and I think that's a kind of a contemporary idea in the neuroscience, is that the brain does so. It takes multiple, takes information into account, but it also realizes or takes notion of the fact that some information is a bit more reliable than other information. And that is also captured under that umbrella term of sensory integration. Mm-hmm. Is that explaining it?
Yeah, I think that's explaining it very well. You definitely did a better job than when I tried to do that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I tend to stick too much to the lingo used in the field of research, which, of course, is not very accessible if you hadn't had it. I always like.
I'm still thinking I'm using a little bit of lingo here, but
but still, it's. I think it's pretty understandable. It's. I mean, specifically the example you gave. You have when it comes to localization, let's say, just with the auditory system you have there, where you know, or at least have a feeling where something should be located. When you close your eyes, you can do this, but of course, your visual system tells you as well where something is located. And if those two come together, you don't have a percept, at least that's not how it feels to me. Oh, my auditory sense says it's over there. Oh, my visual sense says that it's there. I just know it's there.
Yeah, well, of course, you can do experiments in which you try to put a discrepancy between these two cues, and then you can see what does the brain, where does the brain go with? Does it go with the visual? Does it go with the auditory? And does that depend on the reliability of that information? And that's all that falls under this topic of sensory integration.
And what type of sense can you mess with those two systems? I mean, it doesn't have to be these two systems, just any two systems that are supposed to give a very similar source of information for a percept.
Yeah. So of course, you can mess around with that if you wish. Of course, you can control this experimentally. But also in the real world, the brain needs to take into account that not all the information that arrives in the brain is equally precise.
Yeah.
It's like the classical example that you can find in the literature, and that I also tell students a lot, is that if you have two thermometers and you want to record the temperature, and so you take your one thermometer, and it's not a very precise thermometer. So let's say it measures the temperature within 5 degrees Celsius. So you put it outside your window, and what are we now? We are in February. So it tells you it's about 6 degrees. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then you take the other thermometer, and you also know it's a bit better thermometer. It tells you the temperature within 2 degrees. And so you also put it outside, and it tells you it's 10 degrees. Yeah. And then I ask you, now you have two measurements. What's the temperature? Well, if you work like the brain, you would say, well, let's not throw out information, because I have two samples from two thermometers. I know that one is a little bit more precise than the other one. And so what the brain would tell you, what you should be doing is, weigh the two bits of information, but weigh the information that is a little bit more precise, put a little bit of heavier weight, trust it a little bit more. And so, but also don't forget about the other one. And so if the one says it's 6 and the other one says it's 10, The one that tells you it's 10 is probably a little bit more, which is a bit more precise. Well, rely a little bit more on that one. And so make an estimate. Well, maybe it's 9 degrees, right? So then you are then you do integration, how the brain would do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of crudely said, 4 eyes see more than 2.
Yeah.
But keeping in mind that, what if the other 2 eyes are, I don't know, they're wearing some blurry glasses or something.
Yeah, but rely then a little bit more on the better eyes.
Yeah.
But don't throw out the information from the blurry spectacles.
Because any additional information is useful.
It's useful.
But how does the brain then know how reliable the sensory source is? Is that something we learn over our lifetime?
Yeah, the brain might learn it. But that's a very deep question already in the neurosciences. How does the brain know what the precision is of a signal, right? Or does it? And we call that precision. We often make a distinction between, let's say, a bias in the system. So it's a kind of a systematic error relative to what we think is the truth, and we don't even know the truth, right? But suppose we assume that there's a bias, and we call it in our lingo we call that the accuracy.
Yeah.
But let's say the reliability, we would refer to that as the precision. And the question then is, how does the brain know about its precision? Apparently, the brain is able to learn, get a feel for that notion, because if you experimentally make inputs to a particular sensory modality a little bit more precise, the brain will start relying more on that information. It's even what you see in patient groups, right?
Yeah.
If particular patients lack a particular sensory system because of a disease or what have you, then what you will be seeing is that the brain starts to rely more on the information that remains, which makes sense, of course.
Makes sense, yes.
But
it's amazing.
At least we can track that process.
Yeah. So you're saying it's possible to artificially, on a short-term basis, make one sensory source a bit less accurate, a bit less precise. And by doing that, you can then measure, just by knowing how accurate the other source is, you can then basically predict, okay, if things are weighed the same way, behavior should go that way, but if it's reweighed, it should go in that direction.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing.
And that's what people have shown. That's you can see it in the behavior. You can even see it at the neuronal level, right? So in the brain.
Yeah. But you make use of not only behavioral measures, right? You make use of neuroimaging techniques as well, like the FMRI, EEG as well.
Yeah.
And you use also brain stimulation techniques,
also,
right? The TMS to disrupt processing. How I'm always wondering, the fMRI environment is a very constrained one. You're pushed into this tube. Yeah. It's very loud. So I guess
it's not always very pleasant there. No.
No. But I mean, studying, for example, the sensory system of audition can be challenging, I guess, in such a loud environment. But you said you can also see it neuronally. How would those experiments look like? And what have you learned from those? What have we learned from those?
Well, of course, most of these experiments, they are computationally guided. That means we try to guide them by setting up a kind of prediction based on some modeling exercise. And the model that we keep in mind is that the brain works like I just explained, how this process of sensory integration works more, let's say, in the optimal sense. If the brain would be an optimal system, which is not a perfect system, it should behave like this. Maybe we can get back to that later. But then, of course, you can do experiments in a scanner, fMRI scanner, which is indeed very constrained. And I was just saying it's not very pleasant, but what I see is if I put subjects, participants in an fMRI scanner, let's say later at the day, let's say at 4:00 in the afternoon, most of them fall asleep because of the very...
I'm a victim of that.
Very sustained noise that comes up. All these beats that keep on drilling you. It puts you asleep.
That's right.
So in that sense, it's not that unpleasant.
They had to wake me up.
You can do people nap there, and you see it on their eyes. If you, of course, we track the eyes, and we see if people are still awake and not asleep. If they start falling asleep, you already see the eyelids. They go down, and then you try to wake them up. Come on, wake up, Achmal. Anyway, that's on the fMRI scanner.
Yeah.
But what you could do, of course, doing auditory stimulation in an fMRI scanner is not the easiest.
Yeah.
And what you could do is you can present the auditory stimuli within the, let's say, within the noiseless spirits of the fMRI scanner. But it's still tempting, and of course you can use headphones and all of that. But most of these experiments are done using the visual system, just looking at visual pictures. And now what you can do is you can make these pictures a bit more noisy.
Right.
You can blur them, basically, in your words. And then you can see how the brain responds to blurry images. And with some, and that's what I call computational guidance, then you can make predictions about what would you find if the brain would be an optimal observer. If it has to interpret two images, for example, would we find, let's say, this precision that I was just talking about, would we see this encoded in neural activity? Mm-hmm. And some people claim that they can show this. But that's really ongoing work now. Many people in the field are working on that.
Right.
And then the question is, of course, how does the brain do that? Mm-hmm. The brain is a bunch of neurons. How do these neurons encode that information?
Yeah.
And where's the precision encoded, if you can say so? Well, these are all questions that are currently being addressed.
Because there's another dimension that can be played with when it comes to the precision, which is also of time, of course.
Of course.
It's not only is the image blurry, but how long were you allowed to see it?
Of course. That's the way to manipulate, let's say, the noisiness or the precision of an image. If you view it for 10 milliseconds, of course you are a bit less precise in where you think about the image than when you can view it for, let's say, 2 seconds, which is infinite time for the visual system.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so the experiment, to be fully honest, that I fell asleep in was
not ours, right?
No. No. Well, I fell asleep in one experiment, but that was not in the scanner. That had it was a long day. Let's say it like that. Yeah. But the one I fell asleep in was in the scanner, and it was an experiment where it was a decision-making experiment where you saw a pattern of dots which were moving either left or right, and you had to basically decide they're moving right or they're moving left.
Yeah.
But because you have all these dots, the level of noise could be very well manipulated, which was to me so difficult. Maybe it was just me, but they said my performance was very good, but to me that's not how it felt at all.
Yeah, well, this is a classical experiment. This is a very popular experiment in the neurosciences, in which you look at a random dot pattern, as they call it. And what you can do is you can ask subjects, do the dots move to the left or to the right on average? And of course, if 50% of the dots moves to the left and the other 50% moves to the right, or they all move in random directions, it's your chance. Yeah. And you'll find then, if you present those images multiple times, you will be a chance. Sometimes you say left, sometimes you say right, but on average you will be 50%, you will make a correct response. But then you can manipulate, let's say, a certain number of dots moves coherently in a particular direction, left. Mm-hmm. And then there is a level of coherence in which you always say, well, I now see it moving to the left. And so you can determine that decision curve, as you refer to that. And of course, then you can look at where do we find this accumulation of the evidence. If I look at that pattern, this process of evidence accumulation of coming to a decision, do I say left? Do I say right? Where does it take place in the brain? And of course, there's ideas about. There's all kinds of structures in the brain that process dots that move in a particular direction. They process visual motion, as we call it, stuff that moves by. And you will see in those areas that there is that process of evidence accumulation that helps you to come to a decision. This stuff moves left. This in this pattern, it's on average moving to the left, and in this pattern, it moves to the right. And your perception, your uncertainty about your response is sometimes even not matching your behavior.
Yeah. I think that's so. The first time I remember seeing that in a textbook, I was amazed that you could literally see in the neuronal activity the accumulation in these specific visual areas of just the random dot motion. And I was always fascinated by using sensory integration or this type of research for looking into decision-making processes themselves. Because you just have, so not trying to take away from just, let's just call it regular decision-making, where it's more about you actually have a choice between two things and you have to pick one of the two. Right. But to me, it feels you just have so much more control and so many more knobs to turn that you can just, because I'm very convinced the principal mechanism should be the same. But that's just me. So I have lots of debates with experts on this.
No, I think that is actually my, that's, but of course you have worked in this lab, so you also know a bit my thesis here. But,
of course.
That I think, I think maybe, believe is a bit, maybe not the right wording. I think that by studying let's say, somewhat lower level sensory motor systems, as I would call them, it's not only the sensory systems, but also the connection to the motor systems. So the sensory motor systems, they can really help you to understand particular principles that might be generalizable to other systems. That's a little bit how and I've called this before. And I think by studying sensory motor system, you basically open up a window into cognition. By looking at sensory motor systems, you can study how the brain analyzes information. But that information can be well controlled by an experimenter. So you get a handle on how does the brain deal with information or with uncertain information. How does the brain draw conclusions out of sensory information about from information or multiple streams of information.
Right.
And that's, of course, and we call this the inference problem. There's nothing else than drawing conclusions. So how do we draw conclusions? We draw conclusions every single moment in our lives based on multiple inputs. But can we now really pinpoint particular aspects of that process by studying the sensory motor system? That's what I believe, and therefore I'm studying the sensory motor system. Or how do we learn? Of course, there's a big gap between learning in the classroom and learning to control your body or to improve your forehand in tennis, or bring it even back to the lab. But I still believe that particular principles that we discover there might be generalizable to more real-world environments, and therefore I'm trying to study these systems.
Right. No, I think so too. I mean, obviously I think so too. I worked here as well, but I just, the more I learned about the very fundamental nature of this type of processing, just because it's so basic, doesn't have to mean it's simple at all. And the mechanisms that I've seen here and also the models we've worked on, I see now being used in other fields of research. They just call them differently.
Sure.
But the principles are the same, which I just like to think about it like this way. If you have one principle that you can apply at multiple different things, why using multiple different things?
Exactly.
And so far the brain has been pretty efficient.
Yeah, but I think that's also our humans, the human nature. We try to use particular semantics in order to put meaning to particular things. We talk about language, we talk about perception, we talk about
attention,
motor, attention, consciousness. But I think what we would like to find out are these more cognition general principles. And my point here is that, but of course, you can have different opinions on this one, but at least by studying, let's say, sensory motor systems, we can at least try to discover some of these principles, and then we can see whether they can be generalized to other cognitive domains. And that would be, I think, very interesting, right? If we have understood the more general principles, and we have an insight in those, then I think we really push the science forward.
Yeah, I like to think of it as layers of abstraction. Right? If you look at, as you said, language, and you try to explain language by just explaining how the muscles of the mouth work, you miss a lot.
Sure.
But being able to move the muscles of the mouth is a fundamental part of being able to produce language.
Sure.
And that's how I like to think about it. You have these very fundamental principles, and then whichever layer of, let's just say, cognition you put on top, they are required. And then other layers of abstraction might use exactly the same principles, not the same sources of information to the same degree, but that's what the abstraction is for.
Exactly, yeah. And therefore I also think that building up models about particular brain functions, or models about the brain, that they could be very useful. But then there's always the question and it's maybe a little bit in relation to your comment here, is that at which level do you build these models? Eh? And of course, there have been ideas in the literature. David Marr, a famous vision scientist, already proposed this idea of different levels by which you can describe a system. You can describe it more at the computational level. So what does the system need to do? What kind of computations does it need to make? How then do you implement these computations? Mm-hmm. That's the lower level. And what kind of algorithms make that link between computation and implementation? And so even that kind of approach can be very useful to understand sensorimotor systems, but it can also be very useful to understand language.
Yes.
Or whatever cognitive domain that we as humans, it's our taxonomy, right?
Yeah.
It's our labeling.
It's our labeling, you're right.
Yeah. This is quite useful. It has appeared quite useful. But still the question if the brain operates like that, in that sense. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, that's a tough one to answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we're the ones who try to figure it out, and we need some type of, framework or language in that sense to describe it.
Yeah, we need a language in order to describe it. We need language in order to come up with some conception of what we think is going on there, right? And the more abstract we can make that language, so the more formal we can make it, and then you enter this world, this idea of making computational models, because they make very often precise. Yeah. At least you formalize in a very precise manner what you really mean. And those models can make predictions, and these predictions can be wrong. But at least then you've learned something, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole idea of science, right? You're supposed to disprove your models, not supposed to keep proving them.
That's the whole proper idea, right? You disprove theories.
Yeah, that's what I found difficult to explain to a lot of also listeners, because it often seems as if the scientist's job is to find evidence to support something, but it's rather find evidence to not support something, because that's then when things break down, in air quotes, that's when it gets interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
Not when you keep confirming the same old story.
No, of course, I think everyone would agree that gravity is a very useful notion in order to
of course,
understand particular phenomena in nature.
And replication is, I'm not trying to dismiss that. It's very important.
No, but in the end, our scientific theories, they need to be disproven, right?
So what I thought was interesting is I saw this TED talk from Daniel Wolpert, and he's also a movement scientist, and when he gave his talk, he was referring to. Let me just call it the Bible of Neuroscience, the principles of neuroscience,
the Kandel book.
From Kandel and Schmidt and Schwartz. Sorry, not Schmidt, Schwartz.
Schwartz. And Jesse.
And Jesse, exactly. And he was referring to it, and he just explained, okay, look, in 2000 or 2001, that book had X many pages. And now 10 years later, actually I'm seeing it in your bookshelf.
It's pretty thick, huh?
It's very thick. And that 10 years later, instead of the pages to become less, it became more. And his point was, we are not, it looks like we understand more, But that's not the case, because the more we understand, as in being able to, as you said, right, the put them in language, to abstract these notions, to have principles that apply to many things, very, very exact definitions, there shouldn't become more pages. That's what he said.
Of course.
What do you think about that? You think he was
Well,
exaggerating?
no, yeah. It's making the point.
Yeah.
Let's be fair here.
Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes also science needs to build up a big database before we see, before we have a new breakthrough, right?
Right.
And in the end, it also depends on what do you think or what do you feel. Well, what is understanding? What's your philosophy? When do we understand something?
Yeah.
Do we understand something? Yeah, there's also different ideas about it. Do we understand something if we can drive a model? Yes, Daniel Wolpert was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Or do we understand something if we can build it?
Mm-hmm.
As Feynman was saying.
Yeah, as Feynman was saying.
So there's different notions of what people mean by understanding, and sometimes we might have to do many different experiments in order to come up with a new theory. So I'm not saying that it's bad that we add more data.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we should also work on trying to capture these data in some understanding that can make it a little bit more concise, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I would agree to that. But I still find understanding is somewhat a loose term.
Yes,
yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
But that's what I like about just neuroscience in general, because it's just interdisciplinary by its own nature.
Yeah.
And not trying to bash any other sciences here, but at the beginning, when I started out, I had no idea how big the philosophical component is in neuroscience, right next to the engineering component, right next to the computational, then the biological one. And I think this gives it doesn't necessarily make it easy to be coherent across all these subparts. But I find that actually to be a strength, because every subpart might think about what you just said. What does it mean to understand something? Slightly different. And every part works on it, not necessarily on their own, but from their perspective, which can be quite enriching.
I think so too. I think it's, well, the more diverse the group of people is that works on a particular topic or field, and I would argue that's the better, and the higher the chance for a breakthrough in a particular domain. Yeah. Even though I still think that neuroscience is waiting for we are not in physics yet, right?
No.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Far from that.
Yeah.
There's no. Well, I don't. Yeah. We don't have the Newton's laws yet.
No. And
or the periodic table in chemistry, or the genetic code from biology.
But it also makes it interesting, right?
Yes, of course. Yeah. I think there's always there are always things to keep pushing.
Yes.
And which I find fascinating, because it's such a personal thing to everyone. I mean, specifically perception. It just feels this is what fascinates me. To us, perception feels so good, like we are very good at it. But when you start measuring it, you start to see how bad we actually are at it.
Well, or how optimal our perception is tuned in order to survive in the world in which we live.
That's true. Yeah. And how quick it can adapt.
Yeah, and then I think I think you always have to make a distinction between what is optimal, and the brain seems quite optimal, and what's perfect. The brain is not quite perfect, no.
No.
It seems to do what it just needs to do.
Yeah, but I would say that's a very specific trade-off. You can be perfect, but then it's rigid.
Yeah.
Or you're flexible and optimal for that specific situation, to your capabilities, of course, of the system.
But the good thing is that we are even not aware of particular sensory systems, right? Yeah, we do lots of research, as you know, on the vestibular system.
Yeah.
It's even called hidden sense. People are not aware of it until something happens with the vestibular system and they get dizzy and nauseous and all of these effects that people find very unpleasant because the vestibular organ is not working properly. And so we take perception kind of for granted, or that our sensory systems function for granted. But, well, you see it in disease that it's not obvious. You see it when you get older, that it gets tough if your eyesight becomes worse, or your hearing becomes worse.
This is what I actually find quite interesting, is that so lots of colleagues and friends are now getting children, and it's just this thing that they're so excited to see their child develop these motor functions, the perception, and it happens so quickly. If you think about it, just from a computational perspective, it's quite remarkable of what's happening.
Yeah, especially in the first year.
Especially in the first year. Yeah. But then, just as you said, as soon as it's up and running, nobody thinks about it anymore. It's like, okay, now it's good. And it's as you said, taken for granted.
Yeah, I take it for granted, or push your systems now and then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, participate in some, if you can, in some sports activity, and you'll notice that your sensorimotor systems, at some point there's a limit to them, right? And that's not only the sensorimotor systems as we talk about them, sensory modalities, or the motor system, muscles, etc. Of course, there's a whole lot of cognition that goes into it. Persistence, endurance, motivation, all that.
Coming back to a previous thing that you said when it came to the breakthrough. I don't know if you heard of it, but so now you have this company that Elon Musk started. It's Neurolink. Yeah. And Philip's working there now, isn't he?
Yeah.
Sapes?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen him in a few videos, which I think is great.
The sewing machine.
I'm sorry?
The sewing machine.
The sewing machine. Yeah. Tell me about it. I don't know anything about it.
How they bring in electrodes into the brain.
Yeah.
Kind of sewing.
What do you think about what they're doing in regards to the research?
Well, I don't have a very strong I'm not very informed, probably. I know a little bit the company. I know what they try to work on.
What is that actually? I don't really know that well.
Well, I think what they try to do is to connect, but it almost sounds a bit science fiction, to use the brain as a computational device in order to perform better, right? Even try to add some AI to the brain in order to make the brain an improved and even superb system. And that's very science fiction-like.
Yeah, that's very science fiction.
But in order to get there, of course, they need to do all kinds of neurotechnology. How do we control neurons?
Yeah.
How do we control how they generate their action potentials, or what kind of action potentials do they generate, and with frequency, etc. Can we manipulate that? And we need a particular device in order to control those. And I think what they are currently working on most is on more developing neurotechnology, as we talk about it. That's the term that we use for that, neurotechnology.
So what I know. I haven't read much about it, but from what I recall is, of course, you hear the marketing side of it, which is the futuristic part that you talked about, but then you hear the technical side of it, and for me that was more down to earth.
Oh yeah, way more down to earth. Of course, there's very good scientists working there,
exactly,
and then they know the problems in neuroscience.
Yes, yeah. But that's what I like. I mean, they recording from single cells is not new. That's not new, but to do it in the way they are trying to do it, that's quite innovative.
Yeah, and trying to make it happen in the end in the human brain, of course.
Right.
We don't want to. Of course, much of this work is currently being done using non-human primates. But in the end, of course, we want to. At least society cares more about humans. Not to say that we do not care about animals, but we do studies in order to get insights in human diseases, etc. Improve the human brain, or improve human function. These are very complex problems to solve still.
Yes.
That they are trying to solve there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it just starts with what's the neural code?
What's the neural code? But it also requires computation. It requires physiology. It requires understanding of biology.
And the engineering.
A lot.
Yeah. Not only this is what I find interesting, not only the biology of how the brain works or how plasticity changes might affect things, but also how the brain would react if you put something foreign in it. I mean, it's also, of course, a biological aspect that you need to deal with. And you have all these other problems that come into just simply measuring from single cells.
Sure.
Which, I think they're tackling that quite well.
Well, can we? Can we use that's of course that is all what we now call Bioinspired computation. Can we use the brain's principles in order to do computation?
Yes.
Even you see now, for example, in computer tech, data storage. Can we make use of or computations in computers? Can we use the same principles as the brain is using? Because it requires less power. It's more efficient. Can we rely on brain-inspired principles? And that's what you also see a big branch in the field is working on that now.
Yeah. And do you have a few examples there? So now you mentioned now memory, right? The storage.
Storage could be just computation.
Just computation.
Yeah. Do complex computations, which are very power intense. They cost lots of kilowatts. If you could do them in the way the brain does its computations, the brain is just using a few watts, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So if we can make that transition, and you see that the field is now going a bit in that direction, then of course we also learn from the brain and have direct societal relevance in a different kind of field. Yeah.
So what's your opinion on all the developments currently in AI going on, specifically when it comes to sensory integration? And I mean, we skipped this now, but also the sensorimotor integration.
Uh-huh.
Maybe we should actually quickly explain the sensorimotor integration part before we go into this.
Sure.
So you explained what the sensory integration is. For simplicity, I would say now you also add the motor system for sensorimotor integration.
Sure. Yeah, but in the end, I cannot see perception completely isolated from, let's say, action or the motor system. So we perceive, and with that content of our perception, we try to do something. We act, or we do not act, or we inhibit, or we do some. We might at least something might be going on based on our content of the contents of our perception.
But so basically, you're saying we're not just perceiving for the sake of perceiving.
Exactly, I don't think so.
Yeah,
we perceive in order to act, but if we act, there will be a consequence for our perception. And so that's a kind of closed loop.
Yeah,
so perception drives action, action drives perception. Of course, where the sensory systems provide all kinds of information, some of which is more or less reliable. The same also up in the motor system. Some signals that I send to my muscles are more precise than other signals. Some movements are more clumsy than other movements. I can improve on some movements. That means that I try to make them a bit more reliable. If I keep on exercising the surface in tennis, I will get better because it will make this movement a bit more stereotyped, and it means it's a bit less noisy. And so you have that loop between the sensory system and the motor system. But one of the problems is that the motor system can respond quite quickly, and it can already make a change in the world without you knowing that there's a change in the world, because our perceptual system, our sensory systems, they are somewhat slow.
Yeah, you have a delay.
They have a delay. It takes 80 milliseconds before a visual cue is being processed, or maybe a bit shorter for an auditory cue, whereas the movement can already be over. And the idea is that the brain, that notion is referred to as the brain as a predictive machine or a prediction machine, that the brain uses the motor system in order to also make predictions about what the sensory systems are going to detect. And so basically there's two loops. There's the sensory, the motor sensory loop, but there's also a predicted sensory loop. And so now you have sensory predictions and you have new sensory information. And of course that also needs to be integrated. And so we also refer to that process of sensory motor integration. But the whole idea that the sensory and motor systems should not be studied or conceived in isolation, that is typically referred to as the problem of sensory motor integration.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Specifically, if you perform a motor action and then you have a sensory predictor being triggered by this, you miss a big chunk of information if you were to study it in isolation.
Yes,
because this is quite important. Yeah. And so there's this one observation which I find quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Every time I go to a bar and I see the waiter coming and they have something on their tray, of course, and then people at the table try to be nice, so they take something off the tray. They should not do that, huh? They should not do that. No. And I try to tell them why they should not do that. They just never believe me that so just to explain, the waiter knows the weight of the tray and is very good at balancing it out. Mm-hmm. But if you take something off the tray, the sensory system of that waiter kicks in with this delay, while you know very well what you're picking up and when the waiter does not. Yeah. So the arm of the waiter goes up, which can lead to imbalances and very often to disaster.
Yes.
While if the waiter does it him or herself, they very well know the weight and exactly at which moment it will leave. That's the sensory predictor you talked about, mm-hmm. which then leads to the movement being perfectly, well, it actually leads to no movement because it's completely compensated for.
This is very smooth acting. Huh?
Yes.
Well, it's the same reason that you can't tickle yourself. A very popular example. Why can't you tickle yourself? Because you can make, based on how you control your fingers, you can derive the sensory predictions and the brain can tune them down.
Exactly.
Whereas you are going to tickle me, I can't make these predictions because I have no access to your motor system.
Yeah.
And so it feels very ticklish.
Yeah.
But same idea.
Exactly, same idea. Yeah. But I just find it so fascinating that whenever I bring this up in wherever I am, people just don't believe me. Because they feel as if everything is so perfect in our sensory processing and control that they just don't believe me. And we end up with a tray and everyone trying this 20 times because they are very convinced they will get better at it. But I try to tell them, it's like, there's nothing you can do about this.
Well, you can. I think if you do it in a kind of stereotype manner, of course, you can learn a bit.
Sure.
But it's indeed
which is then another sensory prediction, actually.
Of course.
Yeah.
But at a different level.
At a different level.
Yeah. But that is sensory motor integration. Yeah.
All right, and so thanks for that explanation. Mm. And now taking that into what do you think about all the AI development, specifically in robotics? How can they benefit from this actually?
Well, of course, it depends a bit on how you approach those problems. Do you want to build Bioinspired robots, or do you just see it as an engineering problem in which you just try to utilize the correct sensors and add them to your robot and try to solve a control problem? I think there's a world to gain by trying to make the connection between how humans behave, move, perceive perhaps, and trying to incorporate that into robotic devices. And that's subfield of AI, right? Trying to develop these robotic devices or robots. If you talk more about machines in general, then often the interest is also going in what kind of algorithms do we need to develop? Mm-hmm. And, can we take benefit of brain function on how to develop these algorithms, or can we use these algorithms in order to decode brain function? And take, for example, artificial perception. a perception in a AI system.
Yeah.
How do you want to develop it? Well, do you want to mimic how the human brain does it? And that means that you're building neural networks. And that's what people have done. But now people see, well, you have to build these deep neural networks, deep learning. Multiple layers, as we see in the brain, in order to set up vision. And so you see that there's lots of borrowing back and forth. And I think that makes the link between AI and neuroscience quite strong.
But what would you say that, so the one big criticism I heard from the academic side about these deep neural nets that are being used in industry just almost as a one-size-fits-all solution. Like, oh, we have a problem. Just train a deep neural net, it's fine.
Yeah, and then if you have not a problem, train another deep neural net.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of criticism. But of course, I think the AI field is working on that. One-shot learning.
Right.
Yeah? And we call that's how it's called. Can we learn from just giving one new example, as the human brain tries to do, or in a few examples, right? We can generalize quite quickly. Well, there's all these examples, and how deep neural nets can go wrong if it's trained on pictures of cats, and you still see, as I would still recognize as cat, but it's slightly different, and the whole deep neural net is already goes awry, right? It's completely off. But I also have somehow, and I don't consider myself a deep expert there, that the field will go solve that. Yeah. The question still is, do we in the end understand more about brain function?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That is and it's even a philosophical question.
Yeah. I think it goes back to a question of the difference between the theoretical understanding and the application, because I see a lot of people that like to have this in their arsenal of tools, but they don't care if they understand a bit better how the human brain works. They couldn't care less.
Yeah, exactly.
They just I have this toolbox and I just use it to solve my
of course
problem.
Your categorization problem, your classification problem, whatever your problem is, right?
Yeah.
And that's totally valid. The question is, I think for academia, it's more important to develop new algorithms, not
for these deep neural net training.
I don't think that in academia we should build self-driving cars, right? Because that the whole industry is working on those questions.
Yeah.
But what academia can do is trying to push the science forward, right? New algorithms, new techniques.
You mean new algorithms as in how the deep neural net can be trained?
The whole field of machine learning.
Yeah.
Let's develop that from a more theoretical side. And of course, if we train students, people in those fields, they can also bring it into society, right? And of course, we can make the connection to society. But I see that more as the purpose for academia than really trying to start competing with
industry,
all these developments that are already going on in society.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessary. It's think everything has its place, as long as, well, I see the biggest downfall if just specific parties don't talk to each other anymore. That's when most problems
also
happen.
What we talked about just before we started this whole conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So who's in control here? And that I think that's a very fair point, a valid point, and that needs to be thought of deeply. And that not only requires people that work in AI, but that also requires philosophers, politicians, basically the whole society, right? It's a societal issue.
Yes.
And that needs to be addressed, and with all the regulations that need to come in place, and to guide these developments in a correct manner. I think there's really work to do, as far as I can see it.
But how would you go about it? It seems so vast of a problem.
And that is of course the problem. It goes so fast.
Yeah.
And if it can only be tracked by a handful of people, of course, then that automatically enters the complexity, right? If society cannot keep up, that's not good. But I still think it's quite crucial that we put lots of thinking on how we would like to have these developments, how we would like them to happen. And society should also have a stance in how these developments happen, and it should not be surprised by everything that comes to society, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, I think it's important that there's what you're also arguing, that we need connections.
Yeah.
But of course, there's also different goals. There is no a company has a business case.
Sure. There's an economic incentive.
That makes a total sense. And of course, that a politician or society also needs to take that into account. But there's more to a society than just running it by economy.
Yes, sure.
Well, and for that, I think we need to bring in philosophers and maybe people more from other fields that help us all think about these problems.
I mean, specifically, you mentioned self-driving cars before.
Oh, it's just an example.
Yeah, just as an example. But even there, it's how do you? So let's take an extreme example here. Let's say you have just as a quick segue, you have a situation in traffic where the car just can't avoid causing damage. Right? Let's say it can hit 2 humans or 1 human.
Yeah.
But there's no third option. What's the car supposed to do?
Yeah.
And there, I think, is where the philosophical questions about morals and ethics come into play, which is often overlooked as the consequence of these rapid developments.
Yeah.
Because we have to deal with this all the time. And I mean, hopefully nobody ever has to make that decision, but
still in the end, so I read the books by Harari. I don't know if you know them. He wrote these books on the developments in biotechnology and neurotechnology, AI, etc. Very famous, these writer, author, opinion. He's driving forward opinion, but he's also pointing this out. So even your example, what do we decide? So do we then need a bunch of philosophers that say, well, this is the rule?
Yeah.
In the end, it's still a human question too, right?
Exactly. What I heard that how they're trying to go about it is they pose this as a question to normal humans, and then they take that and put that on the algorithm.
Yeah.
But still,
and so in order to get these systems accepted in society, and maybe not the self-driving cars, of course, but also other systems, they take away some of the control by humans, and it might be good. As examples, an AI machine might be able to see more on X-ray image,
right,
or an MRI image than a human doctor.
Yeah.
But in the end, the AI doctor needs to work together with the human doctor because there's more to treatment than just diagnosing, or to healthcare or to medical systems than just diagnosing a disease. But it's very difficult.
It is.
And also your point of, well, let's ask a group of people how they would respond, and let's build that into an AI machine.
Yeah, then.
Because there's many differences in how humans respond. That's what we know. We start out with that. And we have to deal with very noisy information.
Yes.
Information is uncertain. And some people make different choices in uncertain situations because we have not, because we do not know all the inputs to the system, right? In the human case. So how do we know what's the right decision? Well, I think this is a philosophical issue that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And we can well say, well, this is the law and follow the law. But the question is, are the current laws and regulations, are they apt?
I think the current laws are written for humans, for human cases.
Yeah.
And soon there will be more.
Exactly.
And and the development goes so fast. It needs to be, I would actually say this should have been the discussion about all of this should have been started 10 years ago. But, well, I think it's very difficult just to give the politicians the benefit of the doubt. I normally don't do that. But let's say to do that, it's very difficult to see how fast development goes if you're not in the field itself and see every day, oh, we're here already.
Yeah. No, I agree.
But rather than when the self-driving car is on the road.
I agree. But and in that respect, it's society needs to have some control on these developments, in order to protect society also against the erroneous transitions.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is also something, we need to get used to. Just other transitions happen much slower.
Yes.
Significantly slower, actually.
Yeah.
Which that was nice.
Yeah.
Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask the business,
in the end, we're all human beings, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a few more questions. So just to get back to how good the sensory system is to compensate for predictions that it may let me start over. How good the sensory system is by taking predictions of the motor system into account, which is, so one of them that I was always very fascinated by was the eye itself, right? Mm-hmm. It's, you study this extensively. And one of those parts is and if I overgeneralize, just please correct me, is the visual stability thing. I mean, we see everything very stable, but we make eye movements all the time. Mm-hmm. But we don't really realize that those eye movements don't change our percept of the world. But if somebody ever tried to take a picture or a video with their camera, they immediately see when they're shaking.
Sure.
But if you think about it, the eye is like a camera. But how come with all these eye movements, there's no camera shake for us? Mm-hmm. Could you explain that?
Well, that fits that whole notion of the brain being a prediction machine. So indeed, we have the eyes, and the back of the eyes, we call that the retina. There's the layer with photoreceptors, so they detect light, and the eyes they can move very fast. Mm-hmm. We can categorize eye movements in different categories, but one of which is these very rapid eye movements, which are called saccades. And so they can go up to 500 degrees per second, 600. And so you make these very rapid eye movements. But if you move your eyes, of course, also the photoreceptive layer takes a different orientation.
Yeah.
And so if there's an object in front of you that stimulates the photoreceptive layer at one location, but now if you make an eye movement, the same object stimulates the photoreceptive layer at an other location. And you're not aware of that at all. Yeah? And then the question is, how come? Well, if the brain needs to wait every time that a set of photoreceptors is stimulated to process that information, it takes about, as we said before, 100 milliseconds. So you would see snapshots of the world, kind of. And that's what we do not do. And so the idea now is that the brain at the moment, it tries to, it prepares for making these rapid eye movements, these saccades, and it makes about 3 to 4 per second. So you make 100,000 of them every day. So at the moment that the brain starts preparing, getting the system ready to make the eye movement, and there's already a little bit of activation that is helping the brains to move, the eyes to move. So it's already sent to muscles. At the same time, the brain uses that signal, so it's a motor signal, in order to set up a prediction of what the retina is going to receive.
Yeah.
And so the brain is not surprised that the object first stimulated that set of photoreceptors, and now it's stimulating this set of photoreceptors. So it's not surprised about this new sensory input. And so it assumes, well, this is what I knew. I anticipated that, so the world has remained stable. And so that's one of the ideas. And so this is called the problem of visual stability. And of course, you have that not only for eye movements, also head movements. Of course, same problem in the auditory system, touch system. Every system needs to deal with that. And one of the ideas is that the brain uses these sensory predictions based on motor signals. And that's visual stability. Is that explaining it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
But does that then also mean that so if it can't rely on the feedback, because you said 80 to 100 milliseconds, and the saccade is so fast that I can't see anything during the saccade eye movement. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually blind while my eye is moving.
Mm-hmm. Kind of, yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah, try to make eye moves while you're in front of a mirror. You won't see your eyes move.
I never tried that.
Yeah.
But it also means that I have to be the one making the eye movements.
Yeah.
So is that if there was external control, things would feel very different.
Yeah. If you would push your eyeball with, let's say, with your index finger, and you push a little bit on your eyeball, you will see that the world shifts a bit. Yeah, because you cannot make these predictions.
Right.
It's not a motor signal that's sent to the eye muscles. Yeah? It's not a motor signal. Our muscles and brain cannot use that signal in order to make sensory predictions on vision. But the idea is then, maybe to take it one step further, so the eye, or the system, the visual system, makes a prediction about this is what my photoreceptors are going to detect. Yeah. Then, if the eye has made its movement, the photoreceptors will detect that object that is now stimulating it. And so the brain basically almost takes two samples. It makes a prediction, and then it gets the new input on the retina. And so suppose that the object would have moved during this very rapid eye movement. It does not happen. Then the brain will say, well, this was my prediction, but apparently my photoreceptors have not detected it. And so now it can conclude, because the object is stimulated a different set of photoreceptors, well, it must have moved, right? And so by so doing, the brain can create stability, but also knows when there's instability.
Right.
Yeah.
And can you mess with it in a sense of you can move? So basically, the brain makes the prediction and it says I move my eye, then I should see this. But then if you just also slightly change it, not too much, but also slightly, that the prediction itself is going to change.
You could try. You could try if the prediction is going to change, but the movement of the eye follows that. It's consistent with that prediction, then of course you will still perceive stability. But what you could also do is you could say, well, at the moment that I move my eyes, and I start making the eyes, I just, and these experiments have been done, I stimulate at the level of the muscle, that the muscle contracts this slightly more. So then the eye has moved more than you would base your prediction on. Then of course you would create a percept of instability.
Right.
Yeah.
But then would your muscles adjust to that to try to reduce the instability, or you just find
the brain will try to if this happens all the time.
Yeah.
The brain will start learning.
Yeah.
And it will start to create a new mapping between, let's say, the motor signals and the sensory prediction. And people refer to that as the Ford model, as you know, as you have worked on that.
Right, I did work on that. But I should be talking here myself.
No, I understand. But this is the idea, huh? Yeah. So if the sensory, if you continuously disrupt the sensory signal in relation to the sensory prediction, the brain will start to adapt. Yeah.
So you would say, maybe I go too far with this, but actually our percept of a stable world is an illusion.
It's something organized internally. Yeah.
So it's a construct.
It's a construct.
It's a construct.
Perception is a construct.
Yeah.
By itself, of course.
Yeah. And I think that's what often people miss, is the difference between sensation and perception.
Yeah. Well, make that distinction, huh?
Yeah. Well.
So what we there's of course famous illusions.
Yes.
That show you already. The same stimulation on the retina, on the photoreceptors, can create different percepts. Why is that? Because there's a difference between perception and sensation.
Yeah. No, I always found that very fascinating.
Yeah, it is very, very fascinating.
Especially because it's so low level. And it's so replicable.
Of course, and it already happens at the level of the retina. In the retina, there are so many cells. There's a whole neural network in the retina that already starts processing the visual input.
Yeah. To take it, so now going a bit away from the hardcore research, more into what can we potentially, except of course, AI and robotics, gain out of this type of knowledge, understanding these mechanisms. You mentioned before, of course, when we do sports, we get better and better, and we realize, okay, our sensory system is it's not perfect in this new situation that we throw ourselves in. Let it be, I don't know, even throwing darts. something very simple. I'm terrible at it, but you can very quickly see improvements. Do you think these mechanisms that we then start to understand better and better can also aid into potentially diagnosing disease?
Oh, yeah, that's
because they
that's
are
what
so
I would be
fundamental.
hoping. At least that's also what I'm thinking. Yeah, you see all these developments also in even in psychiatry. Yeah, this whole notion of computational psychiatry, which is a new field, kind of. And the idea is that if we can capture particular processes by models or by principles, and under the assumption that everyone relies on the same principles, but let's say the knobs in the system are just slightly differently tuned, in particular between humans, between different individuals or different. If you compare disease to health, then if you get a handle on what the value must be on these knobs, or the range on the values of these knobs, then you could perhaps also try to at least it could help for diagnosis, but you could also help to track the outcome of
therapy,
a therapy or medicine, etc., etc.
Yeah, because it's what I heard very often is that, specifically now that you mentioned computational psychiatry, just psychiatry in general, the DSM book, I mean, it just as it should, right? It goes through specific iterations, but often that's just a feeling of mine. I actually don't know if this is any correct. So people, please take this with the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, sure.
But what I mean is that sometimes I have the feeling that in psychiatry, some diagnosis feels a bit like, okay, this doctor would make that diagnosis and that doctor would make that diagnosis, because you have these symptoms, of course, which are listed, but specifically for certain doctors, you have some might weigh certain symptoms more, some might weigh them differently, so you might end up in a very different category. But what I think is very beneficial about the, let's call it the sensorimotor approach into this diagnostic, it makes it very quantifiable. And maybe that's the computational aspect of this. I mean.
It's completely, of course, but it's also known that all models are wrong. Huh?
Sure.
Let's keep that in mind too.
Yeah.
And then you can still shift. Well, you can use the same arguments as you now made for the DSM in relation to the models. You can say, well, this is the wrong model, right? And I'm relying more on that model.
Yeah.
So you get the same. So it's not an easy problem to solve, but I still believe, at least I feel, that by taking computational approaches, we at least are very formalistic in phrasing and conceiving what we think we are measuring or we're quantifying.
Yeah.
And that could be useful. But that's not to say that this is the perfect approach, but it's an approach that now you see this developing in the field. There's more computational approach, and it's applied now to psychiatry.
Right.
But you also see it now more and more in psychology, of course.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think I don't mean necessarily saying a model is better than the doctors themselves, because obviously they're applying a model as well. I think I mean the standardization of quantifying.
You get a different type of standardization.
Yeah. I think that's what I
that's what you meant.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a big leap forward, and can be.
Can be. It still needs to prove itself, probably.
That's true.
But I also am not an expert here.
That's true. Well, but still. As one of my last questions, I see in industry VR a lot. And I hear, I mean, these predictions are now a little, well, maybe I should say outdated, because they didn't come to life yet, but that VR will be all around us. We will do everything with VR. And then there came AR, being augmented reality. How much do you think those things, those approaches, those devices will mess with our minds?
Of course, they well, it depends on how you want to use them, right? if you want to create VR to simulate the real world and do things that you do not want to do yet in the real world, for example, in therapy, you could use VR in order to teach patients to walk again, for example. In particular patient groups, for example, stroke patients, you do not dare to put them on the street yet because it's too dangerous. Then you could set up a VR environment in which it simulates the real life situation, perhaps with a treadmill and all of that, and a whole three-dimensional visual display that simulates the real world in order to set up a therapy or do experiments that are unsafe to do yet in real life. Of course, it's never completely real life. I still believe in VR as making the connection between, let's say, that's also how I see it now, and also the direction that we take as a group, to make a connection between what we do in the lab and principles that we have discovered in the lab and theories that we have tested in lab environments. We would like to know whether they also hold up in real life. But to make that connection, I think VR and AR and everything related is excellent in order to serve that goal, right? That in VR, we will not completely mimic the real world. It's totally true. But we still, I think, we have somewhat of an experimental control that mimics the real world, which we do not have in the real world.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we really live in an ambiguous, noisy environment in which we do not completely control the environment. In VR, we can mimic a real world, but still do this from an experimental control type of side, which I strongly believe in. But isn't that the meaning of VR and AR, that we try to make sensory stimulation as rich as possible. And of course, we can also make it overly rich or biased. Sensory systems are right. And of course, it depends on you.
Yeah, that's on the user. Yeah, that's the entertainment side. I see is going for that. Yeah, is not trying to see how can we control the environment. Yeah, but more how can we get the person more sucked into this, of course, environment, and whichever environment.
Yeah, that can be very good.
Yeah, that can be very good.
Of course, you make it way more a real life experience.
That's true.
Maybe even over. Yeah, beyond real life.
Right. Yeah, that's what I. This is what I like about the VR, especially the Oculus Rift when those started, those VR glasses, when they had their roller coaster demo. So everyone that's listening, you can find those video examples on YouTube. Yeah. I'll put one in the show notes as well. And what you see is the person standing and having those VR glasses on and going through this roller coaster environment. And you, as a spectator, see on a TV what they see. But you can see them being so immersed in that environment is that they cannot keep their balance. Okay. And which is coming back to what we started talking about, is that the visual system says one thing, and your balance system, the vestibular system, says something very different.
Yeah, of course, but that is the at least one of the big business models in amusement parks, right?
Exactly. Yes, that's very true. You're right. I never thought about that. Yeah. You're right. It's actually the discrepancy between and messing with them, which can cause pleasure. Yeah. Now,
or scare,
not to me. I really dislike roller coasters. But most people love them.
Well, in the Efteling, what was it called now? I forgot the name. This attraction in which they really create conflicts between, let's say, visual and vestibular systems.
Yeah, and you also have these. I don't know if they still exist, but when I went once, they were still a thing, and I could roughly deal with that. It's when you're on this chair and you see something happening in that environment, but your chair is basically moving in that same way.
Yeah, sure.
Which is
same idea.
Exactly the same idea. The only difference is there are no loopings involved or anything crazy like that. So it's fine for me to deal with.
I think flight simulators, car simulators,
yeah, exactly.
They try to mimic the situation as much as possible.
Yeah.
And it's very immersive.
It's very immersive.
You've tried them out. I've tried them out a few times. It's very immersive.
It's very immersive. Mm-hmm. And I think it's only getting better and better. Yeah. But this is one part where I think that the fundamental research that you're doing is really, it has actually shown to be important when it came to making them more immersive, because you cannot just make them more immersive from an engineering perspective, because that's not how the brain processes the information. That's what happened with the Oculus at the beginning. They had these problems. They made it engineeringly perfect, but humans didn't experience those environments as real until they were modified to take into account how we process information. And then they were insanely immersive, which I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah, but I think that, and that's also realized now also in neuroscience, and neuroscience can't go without understanding behavior. And there was a time in which neuroscience was really more into, left a little bit out the behavior.
Yeah.
But of course, the brain is shaped in order to control our behaviors. So we also need a handle on how behavior can be quantified, can be characterized, and we have to bring it into our system in order to also understand how the brain works.
Right.
That's also what I strongly believe in. And for that reason, I think it's important to also go to more real world experiments.
Yeah. But how much do you think then can this research about sensory knowledge, about sensory integration, sensory motor integration, perception, how much do you think designers for anything, let it be apps, let it be therapy, let it be sitting in a restaurant, enjoying a meal, how much should the people that design those experiences take this into account? Or do you think it's too low level?
I don't think it's too low level. I think I'm not saying that every designer needs to know how the brain functions, but I think it's important that he or she knows how human behavior comes about, and how humans. It might be very useful to know a little bit about perception and action in order to understand the human condition and make tools or interfaces that link up to those conditions. And if you only approach it, let's say, from one side, I think you lose on the other side a lot. And I think that's what I would suggest to prevent yourselves from.
Right. Yeah. Are there some books that you can recommend for people who want to learn more? I mean, you mentioned Harari, was it?
Yeah, but that's more on Yuval Harari. He's a very popular author these days. He wrote very, I must say I personally like the books a lot.
Yeah.
On how this whole development in AI, biotechnology, how that will change the world, and how we deal with data,
right?
Human data, etc. I think that's useful if people would like to know more about those developments and how they could affect society and what could be coming. Let's phrase it like that. If your question would be more from a neuroscience perspective, what kinds of books should people read? Is that your question?
Yeah, that might want to learn more about sensory motor integration.
Yeah, of course, a few good books have been written. A bit more for related for students in neuroscience or students in sensorimotor neuroscience. There are some good books. Reza Shartmir, you know him, has written some good books, but I would argue they are a bit more textbooks than that they would serve, let's say, a designer.
Right.
There must be human factors books that people could look into.
Yeah.
I have to think about it a bit more in order to help you with
no problem.
A good suggestion.
No. If you find some later, I will simply add those to the show notes, even if you don't know them right now by heart.
Well, there's many great books that I can highly recommend, but if you really ask for, let's say, for the UX type of
I don't know any. That's my problem.
That might be a bit more difficult.
Yeah. It's so whoever's listening and knows about motor and sensory motor stuff, it's that type of book
in that
is
application important. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, because it's I don't know any. I was hoping you know.
Well, of course, my field is a bit more on the other side of that question, probably. But
still, But I'll look into it. Let's see what we can find.
Let's look into it. Yes.
Are there any more things that you would like to add? Do you think there's something else that is very exciting in the field of sensory motor integration that recently happened that you think would excite the listeners?
Well, I think I really would, if I would advise the listeners, stay tuned on what's going on in this field. Because I think what I now see is that field is also developing quickly, and that field is moving away a little bit from pure lab-based experiments, trying to to do studies and develop theories that also hold up in the real world. And that is actually, I think, exactly what also a group, at least some of your listeners, might be interested in. And I see that coming up in the next few years.
Yeah. Oh, I think so too. Yeah. Well, Pieter, thanks so much for taking the time. If people want to get in touch with you, can they find you on Twitter, or
yes,
how can they get to you?
On Twitter, through our website, through email.
What is your Twitter handle?
At P. Medendorp.
At P. Medendorp. All right. I'll also put this in the show notes so people don't have to write anything down. Yeah. Again, so thanks so much for taking the time. And
it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been way too long, as usual.
Yeah, well.
It's been too long time, I mean.
And now we go to the pub?
Yeah, we could do that. All right.
Okay.
So to everyone listening, you have a great day. Hey everyone, just one more thing before you go. I hope you enjoyed the show, and to stay up to date with future episodes and additional content we share, you can sign up to our blog and you'd get an email every Friday. Why Friday? Because it's almost weekend and we want to give a fun end of the week bonus that you can also talk about during your Friday afternoon drinks. It'll be a short email with our latest updates about bridging the gap between science and UX. The content we share ranges from conversations between UX and science, like we have on this podcast, our own journey from scientists turning into entrepreneurs, all the way to our own studies where we dig deeper into concepts of UX. If you want to receive that to stay in the loop, sign up at mind-trace.com/blog. mind-trace.com/blog.